The Cold War, which began in 1947, was a rivalry between countries such as the United States, the Soviet Union, and others. Key events occurred during this period of conflict, most notably the Berlin Wall, which aimed to separate West and East Germany. East Germans revolted against the government to demand freedom, and the wall eventually collapsed. Reactions from both West and East Germans, as well as other nations, followed before and after the wall's fall. Ultimately, the country was reunified. This reunification not only transformed the economic society of the East, but also contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. After the Second World War, Germany was defeated and left in ruins. Western leaders came into agreement that to prevent the country's rise in power, they would have no choice but to separate it into disputed regions. The disputed areas in the West would be under the control of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Meanwhile, the region in the East would be controlled by the Soviet Union. For the whole of 1989, calls and protests for the reformation of the country were growing in larger numbers every day, demanding democratic freedom. The East was the most in need of reformation because the communist regime was the cause of the failing economy. Throughout 1989, protests took place in cities across the East, with demonstrators demanding freedom, change, and the opening of the borders. Since East Germany was one of the Eastern Bloc countries, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of restructuring weakened its control over the Eastern Bloc. In 1985, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was implementing policies of glasnost and perestroika, but instead the Eastern Bloc was making calls for independence and reformation. As the Soviet Union was on the brink of falling apart, so was communism. Fortunately, the communist rule in Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia was collapsing. These countries were providing alternative routes for East Germans to escape the crumbling economy of East Germany. East Germany also wanted to escape the communist regime. However, East German leader Erich Honecker resisted these protests until he resigned, because he lost support from Mikhail Gorbachev. During November 1989, everything changed forever when a government announcement was broadcast by Western media, mistakenly stating that new travel regulations were immediate, without delay. The announcement, which was intended to be a gradual process, was misinterpreted by the media. Once the news reached the East, thousands of East Germans rushed towards the Berlin Wall, flooding the checkpoints. Border guards saw this and tried to control the overwhelming crowds, but it was just too much for them to manage. So the border guards had no choice but to open the wall's gates, allowing those free entry into West Berlin. East Germans began to physically dismantle the wall with tools such as hammers and chisels. These people were known as Malspekte, or wall peckers. The wall fell on November 9, 1989, after 28 years of separating West and East Germany. Right after the mass collapse of the Berlin Wall, thousands of East Berliners crossed into Western Berlin throughout the night of November 9, 1989. West Berliners would welcome those coming from the East and celebrate with joy, not only because of their reunion, but the Cold War was near its end. Although the unification of Germany would be a breakthrough that would change European history, challenges related to integration remain, especially to this day. The Berlin Wall's collapse worsened the conditions in the East as majority of the skilled workforce from East Berlin transitioned to the West. This triggered a chain reaction of unemployment across East Germany, from which many East Germans suffered even after the unification. East German goods that Eastern Berliners tried to sell could not generate a profit, as consumers were unwilling to spend on these products, instead opting for goods manufactured in the West, which led to unemployment among East Germans. Although some East Germans would struggle for a while to adjust to the mighty power of the West, the Soviet Union would face a symbolic collapse, impacting many. In December of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev no longer wanted to use military forces to expand communist rule in Eastern Europe. Back in Germany, the country would face its first free elections in the East in March of 1990, which brought a partnership that favored rapid unification. The Berlin Wall's collapse left a legacy that is still active today since it created a profound aftermath for the rest of the European continent. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl agreed to the creation of a common currency that most European countries would share, known as the euro. This decision would help Germany pursue further into European integration. As the country made progress in rebuilding, the European Union would start to form. The EU was established by the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. Maastricht contributed to establishing the framework for a common currency. The reunification of Germany would influence former Eastern Bloc countries to join the EU, and between 2004 and 2007, EU members would increase from 15 to 27. Countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Baltic states are all part of the EU. The Berlin Wall also influenced another organization to expand, namely the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The wall's collapse prompted NATO to shift from its defensive role in the Cold War to maintain stability in the European continent, expanding the influence of democracy and inviting former Eastern Bloc countries to join the organization. Just like the EU, NATO's mission is to keep European and non-European countries such as the United States bound together. In short, NATO seeks to safeguard the security of freedom of its members through political and military norms. The European Union and NATO may not have solved all regional problems, still, it has strengthened cooperation and trust across the European continent, leaving a lasting impact that began with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The news of this symbolic reunification spread quickly overseas, prompting some nations to accept the new country, while others were concerned about Germany's rise into power. When the United Kingdom and France heard the news, it was almost as if they didn't expect their reunification so soon, compared to the United States, which put effort into the reform. In the United Kingdom, there was still persistent mistrust towards Germany, and the consecutive Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher declared that until the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, and the countries that border it transitioned to democracy, she would rather have Germany remain divided. In France, they hesitated about unified Germany, and they believed that it might turn towards the USSR. Despite the difference in political rule, François Mitterrand, a former French president, initially preferred Germany to be kept divided. On December 6, 1989, he told Mikhail Gorbachev his thoughts, and from the 20th to the 22nd, he took a trip to the GDR, when reunification was a virtual certainty. Therefore, Mitterrand accepted the new identity of the country. Only the United States had the most support for the West German government, as the Federal German Republic, or FRG, represented its strongest partner in continental Europe. The United States was fully aware that the purpose of the reunification would seek to not weaken the cohesion of the Atlantic Alliance, or endanger Gorbachev's policy of openness to the West. In the Soviet Union, its leader Mikhail Gorbachev would have preferred Germany to be kept divided with the reformed GDR. However, reunification was inevitable, and Gorbachev would have no choice but to accept it. Helmut Kohl met Gorbachev on February 10th and declared that neutrality would be unacceptable. The Soviet Union's need for financial aid and economic aid from the West forced Gorbachev to acquiesce. At the time, the President of the United States, George Bush, met Gorbachev on December 3, 1989, in Malta and promised him massive aid if he was willing to accept the integration of the former GDR into NATO. However, the sides of those who were ready to offer trust to Germany and those who weren't so sure yet often shifted. But as a final result, both sides concluded that Germany would be trustworthy, and its neighboring countries, France and the United Kingdom, once enemies, are now global partners and superpowers in today's world. The Berlin Wall was a powerful and symbolic division between a country supported by Western nations and a country where its economy would struggle due to the communist regime. The wall was built to prevent Germany from rising to power, so no East German could escape to the more prosperous West. At the end of the 19th century, the Soviet Union would face an utter collapse, and the Eastern Bloc countries would break free. As the East Germans heard this, they too sought to rebel against the government, demanding to open the gates of the wall. Finally, on November 9, 1989, the gates opened, enabling East Germans to access the West, yet the failed economy of the East and unemployment would create other problems. As the unified country of Germany was being rebuilt, integration into organizations such as the EU and NATO would expand, and countries that were previously enemies are now partners, all unified by these organizations. Today, Germany stands as a global superpower in the fields of innovation, education, and infrastructure. The Berlin Wall's fall should stay as a lasting reminder of the triumph of freedom, unity, and adaptability over division.